Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are watching the world. My name is Sean Driver, and this is the Red Horde back at it again. Didn't expect to be the day after I do a long video on the issue of the regulations regarding the Armstrong matter. Wrexham's in the news again, this time on the issue of tapping up, or for North Americans, tampering. And so this was a matter I've looked at previously, wondering exactly how far the rules went, and it's come to be a live issue for Wrexham. So let's just jump right into it. This is the Red Horde. So what is going on? Apparently Wrexham may be living on the knife's edge. This one I don't think is a major concern, although it's been raised by the chairman, majority owner of the Wycombe Wanderers. How this came about is a tweet surfaced and then was followed by a number of people and retweeted and discussed about Wycombe reporting Wrexham to the EFL for illegally speaking to Brandon Hanlon. That was one of the players that Wrexham was reportedly interested in during the transfer window. And so became curious as to what the exact source of that was. And what it was is the Wycombe Wanderers have behind a paywall uh, an interview that they have with their chairman, their majority owner, and he made some comments during that. And I'm not going to play the video because it was behind a paywall. I haven't read the terms of use, but I am going to directly quote what it is. So I'm going to put it up here and I'll read it to you. This is Robert Couhig Jr., who's the majority owner, who said the following when answered a question regarding the closing of the windows and potential players leaving. And he said, that this is Robert Couhig again, well, I think that some of the quote speculation, people are entitled to it. It's sort of this fun social media sport. It bothers me when people come on and make announcements like they know what's going on, and they don't. And I don't think they understand the dramatic effect they can have on the young lads at play, their families, the other people in the organization. This past week, I thought it was particularly wrong when people were making announcements that they had no authority to make. They had no basis to make it, and if they knew a thing about how we operate, the first thing they would know is, unless you hear it officially from Wycombe Wanderers or Matt, Pete, or I being Robert Couhig, or say it, you can't believe it's going to happen. So look, we had a guy who's terrific and a big part of Matt's plans. A lot of people wanted him. And I'm not saying we would not have worked with them, but people have to follow the rules. When they broke the rules, we were done with them. Simple as that. And one of the rules is you can't approach a player if he's under contract without our permission, and we never gave anyone permission. So that's the direct quote that Mr. Couhig provided. Now, there are questions as to who exactly he was talking about. Now, that quote came in two segments. Really, what he was doing is he was sort of taking a shot at Wycombe Wanderers fans who were making tweets or posts or releasing potential transfer news. He was also taking shots, I guess, at the general public who was doing the same in that speculation. So let's take that social media desire or the wish that it maybe settled down and people would focus on or wait for information before they started to speculate. I mean, good luck with that, but that was sort of the message. And then it got serious in tone, and it ended up being somebody broke the rules. And the tweets are about Wrexham, but there's also one other potential. QPR were closing in on a deal on 23-year-old Wycombe Wanderer Chris Farino at some point during the window as well. There may have been others that just weren't reported, but in any event, those are sort of the two that you've got. You've got Farino, you've got Hanlon. For whatever reason, the focus has been on Wrexham, and that may be because those people who are in the know, despite the owner's wishes that they were not, released some information that it was indeed Wrexham. So what I'm going to do with that information is I'm going to end up talking about what is tapping up, or in North America, as I said, tampering, and what are the rules. That means having to look at the regulations again. What are the potential penalties if it ends up coming to fruition that there was tapping up? But more importantly, I want to end up looking at what the practice in the EFL, or in English football, has been with communicating with players who are under contract and how that goes about, because it's imperative to know how that happens, because contractual interpretation is not done in a vacuum. It's not simply what's on paper, and the interpretation of it is there are extrinsic aids that end up informing, there is commercial reality that ends up informing the interpretation of what that contract should be, the contract being the regulations and the relationship between the league and the clubs. So let's get into it. Where we have to end up going first is to section 76, called Inducements and Approaches. And what 76.1 states is that clubs, officials, players shall not directly or indirectly induce or attempt to induce a registered player of another club or a Premier League team to leave for any purpose whatsoever the employment of the club for which he is registered or cease to be so registered. Now that looks like you can't talk to anybody and no one can talk to anybody. But we know it happens, right? But let's leave that and set that aside and just look at the regulations. 76.2 goes on and says there is a window that's available for people to end up talking. Public statements then 76.3, public statements by clubs, officials, or intermediaries of their interest in registered players shall be regarded as inducements. So you can't go online if you're officially tied with the club and start suggesting that you're interested in this player or that player. I checked Wrexham's Twitter account, X account, and there's no reference to that. So we're talking about something where they were in negotiations with or communication with or had conversations with or an intermediary did. I guess that's what the allegation would be. We don't know the specific terms of it. What I found interesting was 76.4. It says no club shall employ a player who is on the list of registered players of another club or Premier League club or who has failed to comply with the decision of the board and any player-related dispute commission, any disciplinary commission, or the League Appeals Committee. Infringement of this regulation shall also be dealt with by a disciplinary commission who may impose any penalty they, in their discretion, feel necessary, including refusal to register the player. Now, that one's a little bit different because what that demonstrates is it's someone who has failed to comply with a decision of the board or who is employing a player who is on the list of registered players. So you can't just, without the team having knowledge, go and sign somebody. And in fact, when you go through the tapping up examples, the history, you'll see that actually has happened in a couple of situations where players have left a club and gone over to South America, or they've not necessarily in England, or they've moved over to France was another one, where they were still registered players and they ended up signing new contracts. And when that happens, you're going to get your wrist slapped a little bit harder. But any penalty being in the regulation, that's a little bit too broad. I'm trying to think of what an appropriate penalty could be, or something that's comical. Like, are we bringing back flogging, public chastising, put somebody in the stocks and everybody gets to throw rotten fruit and whatever they want? Who are we picking out? The players, the owners, the staff? Like, what's any penalty? EFL should be clearing up the regulations to come up with removing language like that from their contract, but their regulations. But it is what it is, and it's entertaining to try to picture what those penalties could be. What are the penalties, just so that you can follow along as to what they are? You need to go through, you can stop at 85.1, and it talks about the league has disciplinary proceedings for conduct against any club or official. They can fix a penalty. They can refer the matter to a disciplinary commission. They can refer it to the Football Association if they wish. But really, you dive into what those examples are and what the penalties can be at 93. And Section 93 involves the disciplinary commission coming up with a list of, and it itemizes what those are. I'll put them there. You can order a party to do or refrain from doing anything. You can order specific performance. That's not really applicable here, because specific performance is you need to follow a contract, and specific performance would be what? Hanlon stays where he is in Wycombe. It makes no sense. But you can make a declaration, so you can say that's wrong. You did a bad thing, and the world now knows that's the standard. You can issue a reprimand or a warning. You can order payment to the league, to any club, to any other club, to a player. You can suspend a membership of the league, which that's a step too far. You can order a deduction of points, impose a financial penalty, expulsion, and again, at the very bottom, it gets basically into or order any penalty that the disciplinary committee so sees fit. So those are the regulations that I say are relevant. There are other ones that describe the procedure and the process for the disciplinary committee and all that sort of things, but I don't think those are necessarily relevant here. So to talk about where the significant penalties are, so it puts it into the scope of how egregious this allegation may be, if it is indeed Wrexham, that's the party that's being named. You've got really four examples that I've found, or types of examples, is one where the player ends up just simply leaving the club and then going to a different jurisdiction and not telling anybody and signing up and entered into a new contract with a new club. Not permissible. Another one where there's a declaration of a player unilaterally rescinding their contract, so not terminating with mutual consent, just saying I'm done and I'm out, and I'm saying I'm done, and then a team agreeing and accepting that and signing that player. Another example is where a team encourages somebody to actually break their contract and then attempts to sign them or does sign them. That's another slap on the wrist. And another one where you're actually crossing palms with cash and doing that in advance to try and get people over. Obviously, those are more egregious examples than simply having a conversation with somebody. I want to go back and talk about tapping up, and I'm going to do that for one reason, is when it comes to contractual interpretation, and I've said this in the last video and I'm going to say this before, is you've sort of got two standards. Is you need to either on one hand accept the black and white, what's on the paper, that's the rule, that's the regulation, we all agreed to it, we signed up for it, and that's what the standard is what's the interpretation is on paper. That's too simple. That's not how contractual interpretation works in the courts. The owner of Wycombe Wanderers is a civil litigation lawyer based out of New Orleans. That's what he's been doing, numerous trials and all that sort of stuff. And so one would anticipate that he would understand that that's not what the courts consider in isolation, is just the black and white rules. When it comes to contractual interpretation, obliged to determine the meaning of the sort of the total context and have regard for the purpose of what that section necessarily is. And how does that commercial context get informed? Well, yes, you have to take into account the actual words that are on paper. But what's also admissible are external aids and also the relevant and admissible indicators of what ends up happening. So that is, in that industry, the football industry, what is the normal and standard typical practice? A commercial contract will be interpreted in a manner that is consistent with commercial principles in that industry to avoid an absurdity. And that's the language that the top court in Canada uses, and that's relatively consistent throughout common law countries, which England, the United States, and Canada certainly are. So I'm a little bit shocked because it's not difficult for anyone, layperson, to go out and find out, when we're talking about tapping up, what does that mean and what are people actually doing? When you look at the rule, yeah, it's a black line. Person under contract, do not talk. But it's standard practice, and you can find that when you start to go through the media reports. And I want to cite Brian Clough. Brian Clough was a manager of Derby County and Nottingham Forest, and he ended up saying during an interview at one point in time that we tapped up more players in our time than the Severn Trent Water Authority. That's the extreme statement, but when you go through almost any search that you find on Google regarding tapping up history, you will find article after article after article where people, even the Wikipedia page says, that everyone sort of accepted that it is commonplace. There are certain unwritten rules. That is, you can't ask a player about their release. Penalties or provisions within their contract in specific terms. But for the purposes, as long as the club knows that something's going on, that generally the clubs are okay with it. So I don't know how the Wycombe Wanderers could have been confused that Wrexham was potentially talking to their player, because it was all over social media. And while Wycombe Wanderers may want to keep it in-house and not make it public as a matter of how they do their business, they can't expect that it's not going to get out there in some capacity. And that it was happening in this instance, that there were clubs talking to their players. The idea of entering into personal terms is now standard. Type into Twitter the statement of a player agreeing to personal terms, and you will find a litany of results. So that's why I'm not so concerned that this complaint is going to be taken seriously, or if it is, it can't be to punish the first people up to the trough. If the EFL or if English football as a whole, including the Premier League, decide that they want to limit this sort of conduct, then you need to start to make the pronouncement that we're going to strictly adhere to the rules and put everybody on notice exactly what's going on, because when it comes down to that contractual interpretation again, to do otherwise would be a commercial absurdity. So I'm not concerned about this. Is there a reprimand? Potentially. Is it going to affect the Luke Armstrong thing? Not from an objective standard. Is it possible that there might be somebody who's sitting on the fence who ends up subjectively thinking, you know what, Wrexham, you're pushing the envelope too far with what you're doing? Maybe. People are different creatures, and you can never really know what that outcome is going to be and what their decision process is going to be. I will say this, and this is there's an Athletic article that talks about tapping up. It's from July of this year, and it's got a number of good quotes. And one of the ones that they talked about at the end of that article was personal terms before bidding is now an established part of the game. Trying to understand if the player is going to come in, on what terms they're going to come to you, is a part of the game. The Athletic report basically says, paraphrased a basketball saying that says, if you're not tapping up, you're not trying hard enough. And so this is clear that it happens. It's had a movie made about it in the 50s. There may have been issues with it 20 to 30 years ago, but in that Athletic article, again, it says it's become so accepted that it's just part of the business cycle. So long as the clubs are cordial, it seems that nowadays it's accepted that they can approach players without their express written consent of their counterparts, and tapping up still exists in the rule book, but it is now up to the discretion of the managers, intermediaries, and agents as to how far they want to push the issue. So Wycombe Wanderers has declared, we want to push the issue, and he'd missed the opportunity to see, well, what are all of the other clubs doing? And he got it wrong. That's my statement, my opinion. He got it wrong. So it's a frequent occurrence, and it happens. And just to give a couple further examples, and again, these are quotes that are contained in the Athletic. Google tapping up history, pull up any article, pull up the Wikipedia page, read what the examples are. You can do that on your own if you're interested. But this is just from one of the many articles that pulled in a number of quotes from different people, and some of them speaking anonymously. Another quote that said from an anonymous agent, I would say the line now is when you're speaking to the player directly. So that's not through an intermediary or potentially through other players or whoever it may be. And the agent goes on to say, the moment the interested party is talking directly to the player without the other club's knowledge, not permission, knowledge, is when it has crossed the line. All the time they are talking to the agent, I would say that's fair. Another statement that says, in the modern era, tapping up no longer appears to be a footballing taboo, but a somewhat accepted and partially well-established part of transfer negotiations. Go get personal terms, then worry about what you're going to do for the fee. And the agent goes, an agent goes on in the article to state there, I don't know what it is, what tapping up is or isn't anymore. You will struggle to find someone who knows what the definition of tapping up is, because everyone just does it. So, not worried about it. Is it entertainment? Sure. Is it something, an excuse for me to dive into the regulations again and get a little bit more knowledgeable on how English football conducts itself? Absolutely, but not going to worry about that. So let's put it in box, put it aside. It can go through its course and figure it all out. If Wrexham ends up eating this one, then there's going to be some serious questions. I just can't see it being a concern. I'll worry about those serious questions, and we'll try to assess what happens whenever the press release comes out. But want to just talk about the Luke Armstrong situation just very briefly, because it has become clear in the last 24 hours, and I'll post a link to my other videos somewhere on this page that I'd have to teach myself how to do it. But if it's there, then I learned how to do it. If not, it'll be in the description below. Feel free to watch that one. I just wanted to talk about what we've heard as far as the news just briefly, and what that is that the issue really lay with that international transfer certificate and getting it in time with the window from the Welsh Football Association, and may involve FIFA. I did find examples from a couple of years ago where Leicester ran into a circumstance like this, and I believe it was 2017. where they were given 2 hours to end up going through the process, a 2 hour extension, to be able to put together their materials. And they filed those 14 seconds late. And FIFA said, no way, we're not going to accept that. If it's 14 seconds too late, then anybody could file too late. I think that that's the wrong interpretation. You have to go through the things that I was talking about before. We're looking at intention, looking at obligations, look at reasons as to why the delay happened there. And analyze those facts rather than just say it's a strict timeline, because you end up with absurdities and real prejudice. And I've gone through that before in the video, so I'm not going to do that here. The prejudice, just to identify, that's Harrogate suffering prejudice because they went and got 2 players, and now expecting the fee. They don't have the fee. They've still got the 2 players. Wrexham, because they didn't get the player they were after. It impacts the EFL having to deal with it. In fact, it impacts the player themselves, that being Mr. Armstrong. It also impacts potentially players that are with Wrexham or no longer with Wrexham, because squad lists had to come out relatively at the same time. So you may have players that were going out on loan that wouldn't have to, or that were shifted around and couldn't have been brought back in. It creates a trickle down effect that really the league just needs to clean this thing up and move on from it, assuming that it is if it's the international transfer certificate, unless it was egregiously delayed, and I don't think that it was. All of the reports say that it went in at 11:53 after receiving the paperwork at 11:50. So somebody was sitting there at night, got it at 11:50, shipped it out 3 minutes later, 7 minutes before a 1 hour extension. Even if it wasn't the case where there wasn't an extension, you can't punish a club because it lives in another state/country. You've got to incorporate that. I will ask this, and this is my only request. I'm going to leave it at that. But for anybody who's out there who has seen the actual language that references a 1 hour extension, I would be intrigued to see that. I've searched through all of the FIFA regulations, the regulations for sports transfer of players, RSTP. I've looked through numerous avenues to try to find it, and I can't. So I assume that it's either an unwritten rule, or it was unique in the circumstances and provided sort of on the fly, or it was in that disclosure that was released to the clubs specifically and without public knowledge on the EFL portal. In any event, if somebody has that, I'd be interested in seeing it, but it looks like it's the transfer certificate that's the issue, and if that's the case, I think Wrexham will have a strong argument with the appeal, especially given the status of who the number of people and parties that are involved. And shutting the door for this ends up setting a quite an ugly precedent. I can't see it. So if you like this sort of content, and it's interesting to me, the analytics are, is when I dive into the regulations, what I thought were going to be the dry and boring topic, that's the one, those are the videos that are getting the attention. I've got that one where I did the 20 million turnover review and where that came from, and that's got 5,000 more views than any of my other videos. That's where the interest is. If you like it, send a message, like the video. I'm looking for more subscribers. Again, if you're new to the channel, I'm looking to trigger the algorithm gods to give me more views. So if you like it, hit the like button. Stick around, hang around. Watch parties are coming up. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do the one on Tuesday because I have a busy week ahead of me at work, but I will certainly be back on Saturday, and with a regular time, it shouldn't be a problem. So again, Sean Driver, this is the Red Horde, and thanks for tuning into this one. I will see you later.